The rain began to pour heavily as Claire's old car rattled down the desolate highway. Her windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and visibility was fading fast. She had been driving for hours, trying to reach her friend's cabin for a much-needed weekend getaway. But now, lost in the middle of nowhere, her GPS signal had vanished, and the nearest town was miles behind her. Tired and anxious, Claire knew she couldn't go much farther. Just as she was about to resign herself to pulling over for the night, a neon sign flickered in the distance. The glowing letters read, "Shady Pines Motel." Relieved, Claire turned off the highway onto a narrow gravel road that led to the motel's parking lot. The building itself was an unsettling sight, an old, single-story structure with peeling paint and darkened windows. The sign continued to buzz and flicker, casting an eerie green glow across the lot. The place looked far from inviting, but Claire was too exhausted to care. She grabbed her purse and dashed through the rain toward the motel's office. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single fluorescent bulb, and a bell sat on the dusty counter. Claire tapped it hesitantly, the shrill ring echoing in the empty space. Moments later, a man emerged from the back room. He was older, with greasy hair and eyes that never quite met hers. His smile was wide but devoid of warmth. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, just for the night," Claire replied, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up her spine. The man handed her a rusted key attached to an old plastic tag. "Room 13, around the back. Cash only." Claire handed him the money and quickly left, hoping to get some rest and leave early in the morning. She found her room, tucked away in a shadowed corner of the building. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The room was musty and cold, with dingy wallpaper curling at the edges and a single flickering lamp by the bed. She locked the door, threw her bag on the worn-out chair, and collapsed onto the stiff mattress. The storm outside raged on, but the quiet inside the room was unnerving. Every creak, every drip of water seemed amplified in the silence. As Claire began to doze off, she heard something strange, soft footsteps outside her window. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up, listening closely. The sounds stopped. Maybe it was just the wind or a stray animal, she thought. She lay back down, trying to calm her nerves. But a few minutes later, the footsteps returned, this time closer, moving slowly along the outside wall of her room. Claire held her breath, her pulse racing. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped again, right outside the door. She stared at the door, terrified, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But after a long stretch of silence, nothing happened. Claire waited, straining to hear, but the only sound was the rain pounding against the window. Eventually, she convinced herself it was her imagination playing tricks on her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and Claire finally fell into a restless sleep, her body too tired to stay alert. In the dead of night, however, a loud thump jolted her awake. Her eyes shot open, heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the room, but everything seemed in place. She listened, waiting for the noise to come again, but there was only silence. Shivering, Claire turned on the bedside lamp. The weak light flickered before staying on, casting long shadows across the room. Then she saw it. On the wall across from her bed, the wallpaper was peeling away, revealing what looked like words. Trembling, Claire stood up and slowly approached the wall. The words were written in a faint, shaky script, almost hidden behind the old wallpaper. "Get out," they read. Claire's throat tightened in fear, her mind racing. Who could have written that? And when? Before she could think further, another thump echoed through the room. This time, it came from the closet. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't opened the closet since arriving, but now the door rattled as if something or someone was inside. Claire took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet stayed glued to the floor. The rattling grew louder, more violent, as if whatever was inside was desperate to get out. Suddenly, the door burst open and Claire screamed, stumbling backward. But there was nothing inside the closet. No person, no creature, just darkness. For a moment, she felt a wave of relief. But then, from that black void inside the closet, a whispering voice began to emerge, low and guttural. "Leave, before it's too late." Claire's heart raced. She grabbed her things, threw open the door, and ran out into the rain. She didn't care about the storm or the darkness. She just needed to get away. As she raced toward her car, she glanced back at the motel and froze. In the window of her room, a figure stood, barely visible through the rain. A pale face, watching her, eyes wide and unblinking. Panicked, she jumped into her car and sped off down the gravel road, her tires skidding on the wet ground. As she drove, the lights of the Shady Pines Motel faded behind her, swallowed by the storm. But the feeling of being watched lingered, as if something from that cursed motel had followed her. And then, through the static of the car radio, she heard the voice again. Leave, before it's too late. The voice grew louder, echoing in her mind as her car swerved violently, spinning out of control. The last thing Claire saw was the rain-slicked highway rushing up to meet her. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Claire's car flipped in a ditch beside the road. She was gone, her seatbelt still fastened, but her body nowhere to be found. The only clue was a muddy room key clutched in her hand. Room 13, Shady Pines Motel. The authorities searched the area, but no one had ever heard of a Shady Pines Motel, and no such place appeared on any map. The night was dark and silent as Ryan drove along a lonely stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. He had been on the road for hours, heading home from a business trip that had dragged on longer than expected. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, and his eyes kept fluttering shut despite his efforts to stay alert. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic flashing of passing road signs only made his drowsiness worse. As he struggled to keep awake, he noticed a faint glow in the distance, a neon sign flickering in the blackness. As he got closer, the sign became clearer: Valley View Motel. It looked old, like something out of a forgotten time, and Ryan almost laughed at the irony of the name. There was no valley in sight, just endless flat land and dark woods on either side of the road. Relieved to have found a place to rest, Ryan turned into the gravel driveway. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of old, rusting cars. The motel was a single-story building with a row of doors, all numbered in faded paint. He pulled into a space and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of wet earth lingered after a recent rain. As he approached the office, the door creaked open and a dim yellow light spilled out. Inside, the office was small and dingy, with outdated furniture and a stale smell that made Ryan wrinkle his nose. Behind the counter sat an old woman, her skin pale and thin like parchment. She barely glanced up from the ancient-looking ledger in front of her when Ryan entered. "Need a room for the night," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the eerie quiet of the room. The woman slowly lifted her head, her milky eyes meeting his for just a moment before looking back down at the book. Without a word, she reached under the counter and produced a tarnished key, sliding it toward him. "Room 7, she croaked, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Ryan hesitated, unnerved by her demeanor, but his exhaustion won out over any misgivings. He nodded and took the key, turning to leave. As he walked out of the office, the old woman's voice followed him, soft but chilling. "Stay inside tonight. Don't open the door for anyone." Ryan froze for a moment, her words echoing in his mind, but when he turned to ask her what she meant, the door to the office had already closed with a soft click. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, Ryan made his way to room 7. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door groaned as he pushed it open. The room inside was as rundown as the rest of the motel: faded floral wallpaper, a sagging bed, and a buzzing fluorescent light in the corner. The air was damp, and the window rattled softly as the wind picked up outside. He tossed his bag onto the bed and sat down, the mattress creaking under his weight. As he kicked off his shoes, he heard something strange, a faint tapping noise like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up and walked slowly toward the sound. The curtains were thin and stained, barely covering the window. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled them aside. There was nothing outside, just the empty parking lot, bathed in the weak glow of the motel's flickering sign. Ryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and turned back to the bed. He chalked it up to the wind or the creaking old building and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. The tapping noise returned, this time louder, more insistent. Ryan sat up, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the door. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Ryan froze, staring at the door. His mind raced back to the old woman's warning. Don't open the door for anyone. He sat in silence, waiting. Maybe it was another guest, someone lost or confused. Maybe it was the old woman checking on him, but something about the knock was wrong. Off. It was too slow, too deliberate. He didn't move. Then the knocking came again, harder this time. The door rattled in its frame, and a voice followed, a low, rasping whisper that sent chills down Ryan's spine. "Let me in." Ryan's blood ran cold. He stood, backing away from the door. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to stay quiet, to not answer, to not even breathe. The voice came again, louder, more insistent. "Let me in." He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Not in a place like this. His hands trembled as he backed up toward the far corner of the room, away from the door. The knocking stopped. Silence fell over the room like a thick blanket, suffocating and heavy. Ryan's pulse was racing, but he forced himself to stay still, to stay quiet. For a few long minutes, nothing happened. Then he heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging slowly down the outside of the door, followed by a soft laugh. It was a chilling, breathless laugh that sounded like it came from someone just outside. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest as the laugh grew louder, more manic. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't going away. It was waiting. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. Ryan was plunged into darkness. The only light came from the weak glow of the neon sign outside, casting eerie shadows across the room. He held his breath, listening intently. The scraping stopped, replaced by heavy breathing, right outside the door. And then slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Ryan's blood ran cold. He darted to the bathroom, locking the door behind him as quietly as he could. He crouched down in the darkness, trying to calm his ragged breathing. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, but deep down he knew this wasn't normal. The door to the motel room creaked open. Ryan's heart pounded in his ears as he listened. Footsteps, slow and heavy, made their way into the room. Something was inside. He could hear it breathing, the soft, wet sound of someone or something moving around in the darkness. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He could see the faint shadow of something large standing just outside. Then, slowly, a soft tapping started on the bathroom door. "Let me in." Ryan pressed his back against the wall, his mind racing. There was no way out. The tapping turned into pounding, and the voice grew louder, angrier. "Let me in." Ryan squeezed his eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end. But then, the pounding stopped. Silence returned. For a moment, Ryan dared to hope it was over. And then, from just outside the door, the voice whispered one last time, "I'm already inside." The bathroom light flickered on, and Ryan saw the reflection in the mirror, a pale, grinning face, inches from his own. The old highway stretched endlessly into the night, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the dense forest. Allison gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes struggling to stay open as she drove deeper into the darkness. She had been driving for hours, heading home after visiting her parents in a small town, but she'd lost track of time and found herself on an unfamiliar road, far from the main highway. The GPS had gone out miles back, and her phone had no signal. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional screech of her tires as they hit a rough patch of road. Fatigue weighed heavily on her, and her eyelids drooped dangerously. Suddenly, through the fog of her exhaustion, Allison spotted a flickering light in the distance. As she drove closer, the outline of a small, run-down building emerged from the gloom. A wooden sign, barely illuminated by a single dim light bulb, hung above the entrance. "Rest Easy Inn," it read, though the name seemed a cruel joke given the state of the place. Desperate for rest, Allison pulled into the gravel parking lot. The lot was empty, save for a few rusty cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. The motel itself was a shabby, one-story structure with peeling paint and broken windows. The air felt heavy, as if the night itself was pressing down on her. She hesitated for a moment, but the thought of falling asleep at the wheel was more terrifying than the rundown motel. She stepped out of her car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and made her way to the office. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the smell of mildew hit her immediately. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with greasy hair and hollow eyes. He looked up from a tattered magazine and gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "Just for the night. Allison replied, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the room. The man slid a key across the counter. Room 9, around the back. He didn't ask for payment, didn't ask for her name, nothing, just handed her the key with a strange, knowing look. Allison nodded and took the key, eager to get some sleep. As she stepped outside, a cold breeze sent a shiver down her spine. The night felt unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. She hurried to her room, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. Room 9 was at the far end of the motel, tucked away in a shadowy corner. The door was weathered, and the paint was chipped around the handle. The key slid into the lock with difficulty, and the door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was even worse than she'd expected. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something rotten lingered in the corners. The wallpaper was stained, and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly. The bed was old, with a sagging mattress and threadbare sheets. But Allison was too tired to care. She locked the door behind her, threw her bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. She didn't bother turning off the light. She just wanted to close her eyes and drift off. But as she lay there, the feeling of unease crept over her. The silence wasn't right. It was too quiet, too heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. She tried to push the feeling aside, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the sense of something being wrong gnawed at her. Just as she was about to drift off, a faint sound reached her ears. A soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. Allison's eyes shot open, her heart pounding. The sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from the wall behind the bed. She sat up, straining to listen. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was inside the walls. She stared at the wall, her breath shallow as the sound grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Allison sat frozen, her mind racing, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a rat, scurrying inside the walls. But then, from the other side of the room, she heard a soft whisper. "Help me." Allison's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. She whipped her head toward the source of the sound, the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the room. "Help me." The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the closet, every muscle in her body tense. She knew she should leave, knew something was horribly wrong, but her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed by fear. Slowly, the closet door creaked open wider, revealing more of the dark, empty space inside. But as the door opened further, Allison noticed something strange. There was no back wall. The darkness inside the closet seemed to stretch on deeper and deeper, like a tunnel. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and gaunt, reached out from the blackness, fingers curling around the edge of the door. The hand was thin, almost skeletal, with long, sharp nails. It grasped the doorframe with unnatural strength, pulling something or someone out of the dark. Allison's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the closet. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her skin was pale and stretched tightly over her bones, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and her voice was a raspy whisper as she spoke again. "Help me." Allison scrambled off the bed, her heart racing, but her body felt heavy, as if the air itself was dragging her down. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her eyes, black and empty, locked onto Allison. "Please, help me." The woman's twisted smile grew wider, revealing sharp, broken teeth. Her body jerked forward, her hand reaching out for Allison, fingers curled like claws. Panic surged through Allison, and she bolted for the door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock as the woman's raspy voice echoed behind her. "Don't leave me." The door finally gave way, and Allison threw it open, stumbling out into the night. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran to her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and slammed the door shut behind her. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys. The image of the woman burned into her mind. The engine roared to life, and Allison sped out of the parking lot, gravel spraying beneath her tires. She didn't stop driving until the motel was far behind her, lost in the darkness. When she finally reached the next town, Allison pulled over at a gas station, her heart still racing. She got out of the car, desperate for air, and ran inside. "Is everything okay?" the attendant asked, noticing her pale, shaken expression. I stayed at this motel back there, Allison stammered. The Rest Easy Inn. The attendant's face paled. Rest Easy Inn? That place burned down 20 years ago. There haven't been any rooms there since. Allison stared at him, her mind spinning. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. The truth was too horrifying to comprehend. She had stayed in a motel that no longer existed. And whatever had been in that room with her, it was real.